Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever in the world you are joining us from. Welcome to this AXELOS and ITIL webinar, exclusively for our friends all around the world. So we are talking today about putting service before IT and exploring the future of ITSM. And today's topic is in reference to a piece of research that we did last year all around the future of the ITSM professional, looking forward to sort of 2030 and beyond. So today we're looking at some of the core aspects of that research and the core findings and talking through some of the headline ideas that we came out with, and then giving you some practical advice on the steps that you can start taking in terms of moving towards becoming that modern IT service management department. So my name is Toby Moore. I am an AXELOS associate and I have a background in managing IT services and putting in place different sort of frameworks for IT leadership and that sort of thing. I'm also joined with a good friend of mine and an esteemed colleague, Tuuli Bell. Tuuli, hi, how are you doing?
Good, thank you very much. How are you, Toby, today?
Oh, I feel great.
That's good. It's a sunny day in London today, which is nice.
It is. I have my sunglasses on the way in. Tuuli, can you just tell us a little bit about your background?
Yeah, thanks very much. So I'm Dr Tuuli Bell. I'm now a partner manager at Tasktop, a Canadian company, but I'm based in the UK. My background's slightly different maybe. I did some physics stuff in a previous life, then stayed in service management for a number of years, both as a consultant and also working for a vendor. And now I'm kind of in the DevOpsy world, but also very much related to this, to ITSM. It's actually quite interesting to see the marriage of DevOps and ITSM, but today we're focusing on the service orientation and service management.
So, cool, thanks,
great
Julie.
to be here.
So for me, I'm really pleased to be working with Julie on this particular piece of research and today's presentation. Julie's got a she underplays it, but she's got a very exciting background in science and physics, and she's somehow managed to come over to the IT service management world and make all of that learning and that sort of research relevant, and it's very exciting. So Toby always has a really unique view on how we do things. So we're going to kick off by asking everybody to complete a poll. So this might seem like a pretty wide and ambiguous question to start with, and that's sort of intentional. We want to sort of see how you react to this question. So if everybody could just complete this poll. So it's, does your organization have visibility of how IT contributes to the success of the business? So we're talking about, does the value that your team creates, does the rest of the business get to see what that looks like in real life? So
and maybe if you don't work in IT, if you're thinking of your IT organization, do you know how they contribute to the business as well?
Absolutely, yeah. So if everybody could just tick that poll and press submit, that would be really great, and we'll watch those come in. I'll make sure we do the housekeeping stuff before we move into the phone. Right, I'm just going to flick over to the results now and see how we're doing. Okay, great. Well, that's really positive, actually. A lot of the IT departments that I get to speak to, this is a really big challenge for them because they know that they're doing lots of work on the ground, and they know that their staff are great, and they know that they've spent a lot of time developing and designing their services. And when they engage with the business just doesn't see that. So it's really positive to see that actually a lot of people attending on the webinar today feel that they do feel that there's a strong visibility of how you demonstrate your value. I mean, Julie, what do you think about this?
Yeah, I was actually quite surprised as well. And maybe that's a reflection of who's attending the webinar today. That could be it as well. So if we ask a wider audience, people who aren't here, it's a bit like when you have an election, all the people who didn't vote in the first place, what did those people think? Yeah, so I'm very surprised, but positively surprised, definitely. It's 3/4 know and feel that knowing that how IT contributes to the business. That's a really good sign. But I think there's the flip side of it. So for IT to understand the business services and vice versa, for the business to understand the IT services and how they support each other. I think that's the key thing. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. We're one of the things that we'll scratch into today is this sort of not necessarily enterprise service management as a concept, but just actually service management as a whole, and actually just like what are the values that underpin really great service management. And I think that's kind of where that's going, isn't it? It's that kind of like, well, what do good business services look like, and then what do good IT service management services look like, and how do those actually work together and form a relationship? So before we crack on into the next bit of the webinar, I just want to do a little bit of basic housekeeping. This webinar will run for about 40 minutes, and then we'll be about 20 minutes for questions at the end. If you've got questions, please just put them into the Q&A box, depending on the device you're using. That'll either be above or beside your screen. And if you've got like technical problems that you can't hear or you can't see or something like that, all of a sudden, put those into the Q&A box, and one of the team here at AXELOS will answer that straight away. If you've got questions about the subject matter, those questions will queue up to the end, and that's sort of 15-20 minutes at the end of the presentation. We'll go through all of those then. There'll also be a survey at the end of today's webinar as well, and we're really grateful if you could fill that in, just because it really helps us to work out what does our next piece of content look like. How do we make these webinars better? How do we make sure that they are giving you the level of education that you want and need from AXELOS? So we're talking about the service-orientated organization, and this is a really key part of the research that we did, and it came out as a very strong theme, as what people see IT departments moving towards in the next sort of 5-10 years is this idea of service first. And everything in the organization is being commoditized, consumerized, and turned into a service. And there's a couple of things that underpin that happening. But Tuuli, how would you personally define a service-orientated organization? What does that look like to you?
So a service-orientated organization for me is really one that focuses on the business services. So understanding what does the business produce, what is their core focus, do they produce services, but even if they were, say, a manufacturer or for example, in like product management space, producing something physical, I would argue that even in those cases, they very much are a service business. So they're looking at the end consumer, the end customer, and how do they utilize that product? How do they utilize that service? So they are actually producing a service. And for the employees within that organization, for them to understand what are the core services, and the more difficult question obviously is how do the people, the end customers, how do they actually use that service, and why do they use that? I mean, that's a difficult one to answer. But if they can even understand some of that, some of the reasons behind that, then it's a much easier task to understand, okay, well, this is how we structure the business services, this is how we structure the support system behind those services, and this is how we align the the IT services or other services like HR services, legal services, and so forth. How do we create that to support a service-oriented organization? The first bullet point that we have here, the silos and hierarchies, I think that really relates to an organization which I think a lot of organizations are today who don't necessarily have this thinking of a business service-oriented organization. They might think of different teams working in silos, but obviously somehow producing something that then results in that business. But yeah, I think that's one of the key challenges at the moment.
Because we are seeing lots of businesses, not just from an IT point of view, but they're talking about how do they, exactly what you've just said, this idea of how do we actually, even if we just sell a product, what does that look like as a service? How does the sales process, how does the marketing process, how does the after-purchase process relate to that product? Because that's what makes them competitive as businesses. Companies that just sell products are losing to their competitors when their competitors turn that process into something that is service orientated. An example is yesterday I was talking to a print management company, and they print boxes and packaging for food and stuff. That's a physical thing, but that's only so valuable to a customer buying that. What they're actually looking for is someone who is an expert in understanding, the material and what those different, and the printing processes and how that affects cost and how that affects quality and quantity and all those sorts of things. That's a service. You're selling a solution, and they describe their ideal customer as someone that knows what they want the end product to look like, but they don't know how to do it, and that's when they get to actually marry up subject matter expertise with the ability to deliver a really great product, and that's service-orientated business.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely, and embracing that customer feedback and embracing the future different trends that are currently happening. So, for example, in that printing manufacturing that you mentioned, maybe they want to include QR codes, not just barcodes or something like that. So, and people might want to start tracking various different things. So they might have an app. They might well have an app development organization within that company as well. So there's a lot of things, as we said, that it's not just printing a box or producing a sticker onto a box. So
I think so. And like from an IT point of view, to bring it back to our bread and butter, is the successful IT teams will be the ones that design their services from that business service backwards. Mm-hmm. So if this is the service and the solution that the business is trying to provide, how do we actually design a bespoke set of IT processes, skill sets, tools, and all that sort of stuff in order to actually make that happen and make it happen quickly, make it happen efficiently, all those sorts of things.
Yeah.
If we talk about, when we were planning this, we talked about translating IT processes.
Yeah, I think that's quite an interesting one because, for example, now in my job as a partner manager, I've used some of the ITIL processes in the reverse almost, say service request process. So in a way, my customers currently are our partners across the world. And I think of them, what do my partners think? What do they need? And what's the service that I provide to them? And you can apply this kind of service management thinking, not just in IT, but you can actually apply in any kind of job. So I think some of the ITIL processes actually can be used across the organization. But yeah, it definitely start with a business first rather than the services first. Yeah. So you don't necessarily want to take all the 26 processes and start implementing those straight away.
Yeah, because there's two things there. There's knowing where to start, and that's a lot. The ITIL practitioner guidance, for example, really focuses on this idea of knowing where you are and start with the processes that you need first, whether that's one process or 10 or whatever. The second part of that, from a business point of view, is how does that translate into the language that the business uses? One of the things that we've seen sort of in the past where it's gone wrong is where the business is trying to go on ITIL courses to learn how IT speak, when really what we should be doing is upskilling IT to be able to translate the way that they run their services into something that is both business and customer-facing friendly. And that's, so if we look at, let's jump into this whole service-first thing, because I think this is, this is where we start to get into the more sort of practical nuts and bolts of how this works. So let's look at something like, incident management or something like that, or service requests. And then how do we look at that as an interaction with a customer between IT, whether that's an internal customer or an external customer? And how are the parameters going to move over the next 5 or 10 years around where the responsibilities are, where the knowledge lives, all of that sort of thing. So we've mentioned shift left, for example, on this slide, which is kind of the beginning stages of describing that.
Definitely.
What does shift left mean to you?
Shift left or zero to level support as well. Some people use that. So let's take the example of a service desk. So traditionally in a service desk, you have a bunch of people in a room taking phone calls, or people might come in and they ask different questions. Now, traditionally, I guess these could be very simple questions, like, have my computer's not working, well, have you switched it off and on? I don't know whether 10 years ago they might not have done that, although I did make this mistake myself 2 weeks ago, so let's not say never say never. However, typically people would have already done a bit of searching, they would have asked their colleagues, they would have used some other resources and before going to service desk. So this is a kind of shift left thinking, and this is where your knowledge sensor support comes into place as well. So also for the end users as well as for the service desk. So now the service desk, when they get these questions, they might get questions like, my VM doesn't work, and I've tried all this, X, Y, Z. What do I do now? And now if you had people, say, on the service desk who've been trained or expecting to take different questions, both the service desk person in the first line and the customer will be very frustrated. And also, people consider that's a waste of time, frustration, the customer feedback, satisfaction will be very low. So we need to understand that a number of people in lots of organizations already embrace this trying to fix themselves things first. They will also, how this applies to, say, service request process is for them to for IT to understand the existence of, say, shadow IT. So people will go and buy various IT services, not from IT themselves, but they might buy them online or SaaS and so forth. So this kind of shift left concept is, I think, is definitely prominent, and I think will only continue to rise, especially in the expectation of that.
Yeah, and I think it really is underpinned by understanding where the knowledge lives in the organisation and sort of moving away from this sort of knowledge article by knowledge article sort of way of thinking, and actually sort of how do you start redesigning the architecture of knowledge management in order for it to be a living body of knowledge. I think that's a really, really key thing to work towards in terms of enabling this sort of shift left concept. And it's interesting that you should use the example of my VM isn't working, my virtual machine isn't working, because in my experience, that's the sort of thing that in a traditional IT department really, really has that it could very well be something like that is unresolvable by the first line. A VM not working may well just be a piece of configuration or access management that needs changing, and it can be done in 30 seconds, and doesn't need any release or anything like that in order to make it work. But it might not be something that a frontline service desk actually has the knowledge to do, or the permissions or the access to do. That might sit with a third line team, looking after the VM infrastructure. And that's like a traditional way of managing an IT team. And it's taking something that can be resolved in 30 seconds and turning it to something that may well be resolved in 3 days.
And this is why exactly we need that service-oriented thinking within the business, because that person asking about that virtual machine or a person asking about something else, we need to first understand who that person is and what's impacted, what business process is impacted. Because if that person is, for example, receiving quotations or producing quotes for work, etc., something like this, now this is an example of very much of a business impacting service. And now if that's done, you actually want to kind of prioritize that very, very high up in the chain. So I think going from this traditional approach of we have first line, second line, third line, and you must always follow that no matter what. I think that's changing.
Yeah, because actually, if you think about the sort of hierarchy of that working and how it's systems, it tends to be the high profile and sensitive and fragile systems that do underpin really important business stuff that ends up sitting the third line, because that's where the knowledge is and the expertise is, and we need to make sure that those people, that those systems are supported by knowledgeable people. But what that also creates is a whole bunch of human process and hierarchy, which actually slows down the workflow of a request getting through.
Yep.
So although, yes, it gives you the opportunity to put highly skilled people on a sensitive issue, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be able to do it in a timely manner. And, thinking about what needs to be done in order to resolve those issues, and then collecting that up as knowledge and putting that into whether that's just workflow processes, mapping, all that sort of thing, or whether it's self-service tools or knowledge management tools, working out how do you put that stuff in the hands of the people facing the problems first, and allow them to solve their own problems.
Yeah, and I think this is where various different communication channels come into place. So not necessarily just a traditional self-service portal, but also the use of Twitter, for example. I can't count how many times I tweeted someone for either to say thanks very much for something or to ask for ask help with a question. So, for example, I'm still excited about this. I hired an artificial intelligence personal assistant last weekend.
You have hired an artificial intelligence personal assistant?
Yeah, to do some of my scheduling work, which is amazing. And so I had an issue with it. So obviously you can send an email, but you can also interact with them by sending a tweet. And I just find it a lot easier somehow because you just send a tweet and then you expect a response. And also then others can see what the issues are currently and see the responsiveness and so forth. So I think there's a lot of interactions that you can expect nowadays.
I think so. And actually, we've seen this pattern over years and years and years, which is this idea that things are adopted in the consumer space and then they move over into the commercial space. And the first thing I do now is if I have customer service issues, I contact them through Twitter. And by the time that sort of, that behaviour really embeds itself into the business, the platform will probably be different. And the way that we use things like Jira and all that sort of stuff and service desk tools we may just, but it's understanding what the interaction looks like.
Yeah.
It's not a platform decision. It's not a tool-based decision. It's understanding what the interaction between the customer and the business and IT looks like, and working out where the bottlenecks are and removing them. Mm-hmm. And that maybe that's through moving knowledge to the left, as it were, towards the customer, or maybe it's around just enabling through platforms or whatever.
And I think definitely in the future, artificial intelligence is going to play a big part as well, because all this automation, understanding the, being able to read kind of human language or natural language processing, that's going to play a very big part in the future. Mm-hmm. You can already see that in chatbots, which I think what Microsoft, I think, predicted last year that they would be the huge thing this year. I don't think they've been that big yet, but for example, things like that will get bigger and bigger.
It's only March.
Yeah, true.
So, we actually use chatbots now in our our WhatsApp groups and things like that in order to actually just sort of make just talking with groups of friends quicker and easier, and actually and that sort of thing. And it's already becoming very, very consumerized. Mm-hmm. And as soon as the general public learns the value of these things, then it just gets adopted into the workplace so quickly. Yeah. So we're going to ask another poll question now, and thinking about what we've just been talking about, which is this idea of the consumerization of services, and stripping out the complexity of the interaction between IT and the business. Do you think this means that by, say, 2030, IT will actually completely disappear from most of the business? You can interpret that how you like, actually. But if you could answer the question based on yes, you think it will go away completely, no, it will remain relevant, it will almost go away but not completely, or actually you're just not sure. And we'll give you 30 seconds to just have a think about this. Right, 5 seconds left to complete the poll. If you haven't done already, you've got 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Let's have a look at the results. Okay, that's not what we just had to put the little microphone on mute and took some bets as to what we thought you might come back with, and neither of us are taking the pot home today, unfortunately. So no, IT will remain relevant. So we thought you might actually go for almost but not completely. So perhaps our ideas around consumerization, Tuuli, are not striking a chord with the audience today.
But maybe also the ambiguity of the question as
I think so. Yeah, and we kind of did that on purpose anyway. Yeah. So let's have a meaty discussion about this. So, will IT disappear from the business? We've said yes, and then no. Oh, sorry. Sorry, just a slide flickering there. So the reason that we've said yes and then no is that when Tuuli and I were talking about this a couple of days ago, we sort of came to the conclusion that, and so this is pulled from the research as well, so there was a strong theme within the findings of our research, is that IT as we know it will be very different and may not exist in the organization in the way that we know it now. And the way that it will be managed and the way that it will be led will be different. And the way that we see this manifesting itself right now in what you might call unicorn businesses or something like that, such as Netflix and Spotify and that sort of thing, is they are technology-first businesses. So they're not actually building a business and then building IT services underneath it in order to enable all of those business processes and things. They start with IT service management. They start with the architecture and the infrastructures that are going to underpin the success of their business. And it's a very different way of thinking. It's not going, here's an idea for a product, let's see if we can sell it. Oh, now we've reached a level of maturity where we need to implement IT. Mm-hmm. It's coming at it from the other direction, where it's just kind of like, well, what do we need in place from a technical point of view in order to support the success of our business idea? Mm-hmm. And that's, and that's a lot to do with how products and services are consumed online, and it's also a lot to do with actually just how skills work. Your average person coming into the workplace now, especially in a sort of millennial style audience, have so many more technical skills, and they can just grab at SaaS-based services in order to make the things happen.
And use the services as well in a very different way, and adapt to a different space with different services, and also adopt various, have a very high rate of change in those services. So it might be, we mentioned Twitter now, but it might be something that we, hasn't even been created yet, what we use in 5 years' time. Or at work, I use a number of different tool sets. I try different ones. For example, for scheduling, I actually tried 4 different tool sets in one day and tried to figure out what works best for me. So there's a lot of tools in the market already that we can use, and so the competitive edge that those companies have are normally based on technology and are based on exactly the software component of that.
And as we well know from the various sort of IT service management tool set sort of implementations that we would have done over the years, it's not necessarily the technology which is the tough bit. It's not difficult to set up and install something on a server. What's really hard is the adoption piece and understanding, all of the things that you need to do in order to actually get people using that platform quickly and in the way that you want them to in order to get the results that you want.
Yeah. And then choosing that as well, like choosing first what you want to do, and then understanding how people use it differently. And also, one of the biggest challenges in any organization is, you might give people a tool, but you don't actually know how they use it. You don't have that feedback. So as long as I think IT can stay relevant as long as they get that feedback and they react on that feedback. So you kind of want to keep on changing, and I still think IT is not going to, IT as we know it today, I think that will go away. It's inevitable, I think, because you're going to have almost like a fragmented, all these fragmented different tools, I think, in the future. You can already see that happening, but then you just want to make sure that all of that works together, and this is one of the parts where, say, DevOps or SIAM, as in Service Integration Management, where they come into place and work really nicely together. One of my challenges personally is to talk about and understand, and probably the same for you as well, when you speak to, say, developers or IT or service management or the business, is for people to understand how DevOps and ITSM and all of that, those really nice frameworks that we created, how they can work together. But it's down to the person, really, what you said.
And I think, what you mentioned at first, too, is this idea of just chopping and changing between tools until you find the one that you need. And when we build digital services these days, my organisation is working on a new tool build at the moment, and the idea of understanding how people are going to use that, we're working on that at the very early stages of design, and we've gone out and we've worked out how we're going to use things like Google Analytics, how we're going to use things like click rate optimization tools and things like that in order to understand how people are using the platform. And as we start to sort of consumerize the tools that we use into self-service tools, into sort of self-service portals and that sort of thing, we can start applying those practices and those tools to those platforms. And because it's so easy to chop and change between these SaaS platforms, you can go out and put a heat mapping tool on top of your self-service portal to see where people click and to see what fields they use and what they don't use. And if you're not getting the results that you need from that, you can go and find another heat mapping tool and put it on within 5-10 minutes. And your ability to gain the insights that you need in order to improve services quickly and chop and change between the tools that you're using in order to do that, it's becoming so much quicker and easier. And we've never really applied that to IT service management before. Zendesk, for example, very customer centric style. They're moved somewhere in the IT space, very much in the customer service space. But one of the first things they do when they set up a new customer for Zendesk is they put Google Analytics on the tool, so that the IT team can see exactly how users are using that self-service tool. And other ITSM vendors are picking up on this now and doing the same. But it's that idea of it's thinking like insight and data first, like work out how people are using the services and then improve them based on that.
And understand that both the customers, I think the physical people who are behind it will change, and also those roles will change, so how they use it, and also what they use it for. So there's going to be the only constant is change, pretty much, which is, I think, almost like a theme what we've been talking about today. But yeah, it's very interesting to see that shift.
And as you introduce that style of working and those skills into the IT team, all of a sudden the IT department does look very different. And the skills that you need and the understanding of the technology and the understanding of how technologies are adopted and implemented, that's a set of skills that obviously does exist in IT, but if those are stepping to the forefront of how you manage and lead your IT department, then yes, it does start to look very different. And of course, it's a very sort of jarring question, will IT disappear from the business? And obviously, no, it won't. But it's about, like we said, it's convergence. Well, we said convergence on the slide here. It's that idea of IT and business will become one and the same. The tools that will be shared across the business are very similar. We've mentioned just at the bottom here, SIAM, Tuuli, and I know that that's sort of a hot topic and it's growing a lot right now. And I know we at AXELOS have published a number of sort of bits of content now around ITIL and SIAM and how that works. I mean, what are you seeing in your professional environment around the understanding and adoption of SIAM?
I think SIAM as a framework is in service integration management. Also, depending on where you are in the world listening to this, it might be MSI, multi-supplier integration, or something else, or even supply management. There's lots of different words for this. I think this really comes into place where you have this, where it's going from that maybe a very managed kind of internal IT concept into maybe you've gone through the phase of outsourcing your entire IT, then you realize, we don't actually want to insource our IT, we want to outsource our IT, we now want to insource that. Then you realize there's things like SaaS, software as a service, or there's the best of breed tools which you want to get from somewhere else. You might want to outsource just a little bit of certain things. You might use a small consultancy for something particular. So now you have all these different suppliers, whether internal or external, and you want to get the best out of those suppliers. Now, the challenges of that, obviously, is these different suppliers will underpin your business services, and they have to collaborate. They need to understand how they, or they should understand how they support your business. So what's their contribution to the business services that you offer? And sometimes what we actually see here is we see a shared risk. We see the suppliers taking part of that business service and getting a fee based on profits, for example, or based on the risk and so forth. So there's a lot of kind of incentives that you can work into this, which is obviously an entirely different subject that we talk about. But it's very interesting how the kind of changing, for example, from competitors to collaborators, how that's working. I think there's a word for this as well, where they kind of combine the two words.
Co-competition is
something like that.
Yeah.
But I think that does actually work, and you have to work together. I think that's one of the biggest changes maybe in a working environment. So you don't, going from all these silos, whether those are teams, internal or external teams, you don't now necessarily compete against each other. You regard, everyone's regarded as a teammate. Everyone's regarded as, I'm working with you towards a greater goal.
Proper strategic partnership, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I think what's the most interesting thing about SIAM in terms of the sort of service-focused, service-orientated topics that we're talking about is what having better supplier management looks like at the front line of the business. Because the whole, when I talk to a lot of people about SIAM, what we end up focusing on is this idea that the more of that outsourced waste that you can get rid of, that sort of stuff that you might traditionally hold inside the business and take up a lot of IT time and resource, you're starting to move into outsourcing. And actually the competency in the business is now managing outsourcing rather than managing infrastructure or managing NetOps or managing whatever. And what that does is it creates freedom and flexibility within the actual IT team to then focus on that interaction piece and actually what does service management and what does really great service look like. Those really important things. And if you don't have time to think about that or do that, because you're spending so much time doing business as usual work in the server room or whatever, it becomes a really difficult conflict, which is why science is becoming so popular.
Yeah, and obviously all the role changes, as you mentioned. People will be doing different things, so they need to understand that their role is changing. And we talk about this kind of T-shaped people, where they understand a lot of different subjects at some level, and then they have a deeper understanding of a certain other subject.
So what's the T-shaped people? What does that?
Yeah, so if you that's what I kind of try to explain here. So if you have a person and you think of the kind of the y-axis as the depth of knowledge, and then the width, like the x-axis, as all the different capabilities that they have, all the knowledge. So you want to have kind of a bit of both. So you want to have one very wide line where you understand lots of different things, you understand them at a high level, but then you have a deeper knowledge, like subject matter knowledge, or that might be a certain application or a certain language or anything like that. You have a deeper understanding of that. And that's a good combination of a person, I would think, nowadays, what's really required, especially for this management of suppliers and management of those teams.
So if that's where we're heading, this idea of the T-shaped role, and, I've sort of heard that described as things like service brokering before and that sort of thing, that idea of having all of the understanding what the marriage is between the capabilities and skills of somebody versus their knowledge of the organisation, knowledge of tools and things. Where are we coming from? I mean, being honest with ourselves, what does the role before that look like, which we might be stuck with now, and then we'll talk about how we move that across.
I think that's a T-shape, but without the horizontal bit. Too much.
Yeah, it's a little T rather than a big T.
Yeah, definitely. And I think rather than having the number of years of experience, so you can. It's a good example actually. If you go to LinkedIn or go anywhere, you read the first bit of the summary bit of the person. A lot of those start with I have X, Y, Z, or decades of experience and so on. So versus what you see nowadays is I've done all this cool stuff, and I've done this, I've tried this, it failed, I tried this, and maybe that failed again, but then I tried this and that was a success. So it's a very different way of even positioning yourself, almost selling yourself to an organization, or you set up your own startup, or, all of these different things. So I think people used to think, I need to have 2 decades of experience until I can do this and that. But I think that's also changing. So the expectation of what you're supposed to do, go from this traditional hierarchical kind of promoting from a junior to
analyst
senior
to a manager, to a delivery manager.
And I don't think that's happening so much anymore. So what do you think?
I think people are becoming better at carving out careers for themselves and recognizing what the opportunities are in the business. And I think that has always happened. I just don't think it's happened at the rate that it happens now. And I think, we've mentioned on this slide the millennial workforce, and we've touched on that a little bit already. But it is that sort of, when you look at anything, whether it's sports or whether it's work or whether it's, any kind of set of skills, when you look at it over a set of decades, what you see is that the rate of learning the basics of something increases over time. And what that allows for is younger and younger generations coming into that skill set, whatever it is, and innovating quicker, because they can. What happens is that the methods of understanding how the basics of something work become more and more and more commoditized. And it's so much easier for people to pick that up and learn it really quickly and learn from the mistakes and the successes of their previous generation, and then pick up on those basics quicker. And then what they can do is, once they've learned those basics, they can innovate, and they can disrupt, and they can do exciting things.
And I think there's a lot more sharing of that information, sharing of experiences as well. So you don't necessarily have that culture of withholding information, which is something that maybe still happens in some organizations, especially in IT. You kind of want to keep hold of that information because you're thinking, if anyone else knows this, I'm going to get fired, type of thinking. And I've seen that sometimes in certain organizations where, especially a third line or someone who's been there for a long time resists this kind of change into a shared knowledge management, whether that's a system or whether that's some kind of community where people can share ideas. And I think that's a huge shift and change.
The mentality shift for me is, it's going from I've learnt this information, how do I use that to protect my role, to I've learnt this information, how do I now pass that off to somewhere else in the organisation so I can move on to the next exciting bit and learn that instead. And it's that continual learning rather than sort of continually protecting yourself, I suppose. And this links perfectly to this, the question on the slide. Actually, before we dig into this, I just want to let you guys know that we're coming up to 40 minutes on the webinar, so we're probably going to wrap up in the next sort of 5 to 10 minutes of the conversation and then go into your questions. So if you do have questions, please make sure you put them into the Q&A box. Like I said, depending on what device you're using, it's either going to be below or on the side of the screen, I think. So anyway, Tuuli, how does IT enable better business collaboration? First of all, what is IT and business collaboration? We've already talked about this, but kind of like, let's wrap it up. What is the IT and the business collaborating? What does that mean? What does that look like?
At the very heart of the collaboration is understanding each other. So any kind of collaboration starts with understanding, not necessarily being understood first. So there's lots of different ways that you can do this. So there's different games that you can play as well, like serious games or whatever you want to call them, in where you're trying to put yourself into the role of the business if you're in IT, and vice versa, into the IT if you're within business, and trying to understand where they're coming from. I think that's a very hard bit. And then both agree on certain terms. A bit like when we started the webinar, we had some kind of ground rules. So let's set the ground rules first. What do we want to achieve? What's the greater goal? Because it's a lot easier for people to work together when they understand the why and when they agree on that. And maybe even better if they can create those rules and set together. So if they can both contribute. So you can always, to anything like this, you can always bring like a framework, so you can bring some help and questions. Typically it does help when you have someone else come in fact, because you can have a facilitator who facilitates this conversation. But then, so that everyone feels that they're being listened to, whether that's a conversation, maybe that's an anonymous survey, anything like this. So you take into account how each and every person communicates. And then you start looking at, okay, so this is where we want to be. Then you start with, okay, so this is where we are currently. And there might be lots of different tensions, there might be lots of challenges, and you just lay them out. Okay, so these are where we are currently. And then when we get to, how do we then go to where we want to be? What's that journey look like? And if you break that down into like smaller bits, so you start with, okay, so when can we get there? Let's say we want to get to a certain point in half a year's time. What do we need to do? There might be some changes, bigger changes, and in any case, we want very much management, the leadership to be behind this, and to be very much supporting the initiative.
I think that's exactly right. And I mean, do you think that the reason that hasn't happened in the way that you've described it necessarily in the past for a lot of organisations is because IT just isn't spending enough time in the room with those people when they make those important business decisions? Yeah,
I think that's definitely it. So we want to definitely have representatives from IT for them to understand how business works. One very simple thing that you can do is you can even have your CFO do a presentation of what does the finances look like? What's the kind of core business? These are our business services, but effectively they're there to make money. So what's the financial, what does balance sheet look like? How do you contribute to that? How does that kind of get created? And then when you have these, not necessarily board meetings, but when you have managerial meetings within the organization, then please do invite people from the different departments, because then they have a much better understanding of what you do. Let's say when I was doing pre-sales and I was working with someone in IT, I tried to explain why I need internet access on my phone. It's because I travel a lot. So for the very simple, for the communication, so for IT to understand what does the business do and what do the individuals do, because they will all have different needs. So starting from that, understanding each other is very key.
I think that sort of, that point around having the CFO come in and discuss, where does IT contribute to something like bottom line and that sort of thing. And those are And there are lots of different versions of that discussion across the organisation, depending on whether you're talking to someone who's responsible for sales or marketing or whatever. I remember years ago when I was working on a service desk, our CIO coming in from overseas and sitting in front of everybody in the IT team, who rarely would get together, everyone from development through to applications to support, through to infrastructure, service desk, all of these guys and girls in the room together, which very rarely happened. And he talked to us about a business project that was underpinning the success of the business. And everybody in the room was like, oh, wow, that's kind of cool. I'm starting to understand why we've been spending the last 6 to 8 months building this piece of software. I can actually start to see a picture of where this is going. And we were able to identify what everybody's role in it was. So like from a support team point of view, why is it important for us to be around and available for this project from a development point of view? And then if you've got questions about things, who in the room do you go to? And then, of course, we were promised to have lots more of these meetings so that we could, keep our eye on the ball and understand it never happened. And then all of a sudden the project got out of hand and we really struggled. But the idea was there. And as we move into that
sort of taking action.
Right. And as we start to move into as we get better at collaborating, those things do happen more often, and those things do become more open, and people do have a better understanding around the context of their work and can make better decisions about it. We're just going to move into the next piece now, which is around kind of like the next step. Sorry, I'm pressing the wrong button on the slide. So, what steps can IT take now in order to prepare for this future? There's a couple of questions that have come in that sort of marry in with this. So we'll whiz through this and then go into the questions and dig into the really interesting stuff.
I think, in fact, we've actually talked about this throughout the presentation. So it's a good kind of summary slide. Because we talked about the assessment, we talked about the various different actions. We gave an example where they had the best of intentions, they kind of started first step, but didn't kind of follow that through to the end. We talked about DevOps, Agile not so much, but it's that rate of change that comes from that Agile type of thinking. Agile, I don't see that being anymore being a part of IT. I see that being a business approach, really. Yeah. And everyone has to be on the same page and understand that yes, we're happy changing frequently, whether that's sales, whether that's marketing, whether that's IT, any of these other departments, and feedback as well, and collaboration. We pretty much, in fact, talk about all of these except for not necessarily that on-demand education. We talked about it, me and you, a few days ago.
We did, yeah, and let's not dive into it too much, but it kind of does come back to that knowledge centered support stuff that we're talking about, and rather than filling people's heads with knowledge in the hope that one day they'll need it to do their job, it's making sure that you're creating that living body of knowledge that is accessible, that is easy to use, that is there at the point of you needing it. So when your VM goes down, what buttons and tick boxes can you change yourself in order to make it work again? And making sure that information is always available as possible. The bit that I want to sort of just dive into a little bit now and just sort of get your advice to lead on in terms of what happens, what you do next, is assessing your approach. So what can the guys and girls listening on the webinar today actually go back either this afternoon or tomorrow morning or whatever and say, here's the next step we're going to take in order to assess our approach to modernizing our IT services?
In this case, I would really encourage people to speak to each other. So even though you're working in IT, or even if you're not working in IT, you probably spend most of your time looking at a laptop screen. You don't necessarily speak to other people. Now, that might be because you're working remotely. That might be because the rest of the team is somewhere else. But whatever the reason, I would very much encourage you to grab a cup of coffee, go for a lunch together, just talk about what do you do, and trying to kind of just throw some ideas and talk about what's the purpose of the business, why is the business there in the first place, and then trying to kind of backtrack that to what should I do. And for any of the senior managers, if you're there as well listening, I would encourage very much to talk to the C-level as well, understand the vision of the company, and and really get the buy-in for we do need to change, whatever that change might be. But even if you are currently in the top 10 of your industry, even, there's
why not be in the top 3?
Yeah, why not be in the top 3? And also, you don't know what happens in the future. You don't know what's going to happen next year. You might be in the kind of leading quadrant now, but a year later, who knows where you might be. Yeah. So it's only that change that really drives all the discussions.
So actually, I mean, what I take away from what you've just said too is not necessarily going in tomorrow morning and having a discussion about, or bringing in a template or a tool or something that says, this is how we're going to assess our approach. Actually, it's sitting down with the people that matter most in that space and saying, how are we going to assess our approach? No, that's the difference in conversation. So we're going to move into some of the questions now, and there are 2 in particular that I really want to focus on in the next 10 minutes. So this first one is, which one do we want to talk about now? So I think it's this first one. So what do we think are the most important skills that are needed in ITSM right now? So obviously we've been talking about where it's going, and we've talked a little bit about kind of the old fuddy-duddy stuff that's held it back perhaps. So what are so I suppose what the question is what skills do we need to start bringing into the organisation today, next week, next month, in order to start enabling us moving forward? What do you think?
Customer service definitely is one, and at least some kind of technical understanding of you're probably using some kind of ITSM tool, so learn how that works. You want to learn the limitations, you want to learn if there's automation, if there's something else that you can do, and speak to your peers definitely, and also keeping up to date. So looking at who's the best organisation in my field at the moment, who other service management people do I know, do networking, that always helps. You might get some ideas that you never thought of before. And yeah, always think about the customer. I think customer experience is always is a key for service management.
So in terms of the, so you mentioned customer service as a skill. I think we've definitely seen a really strong, in the last sort of 5 years or so, a really strong movement towards that anyway. And a lot of IT teams now are employing customer service people or employing from customer service roles, like they might be going out to things like people that work in the restaurant and the catering industry, for example, because they're a service first they're a service first industry, and being able to bring those skills in. So when we talk about the skills that you need, quite often those skills are there anyway, somewhere in the organisation. It's actually the skill that you need as a service desk manager or as an IT operations manager or whatever, is actually understanding how you bring those skills in. They're already there. We already know what the trend is. The trend is moving towards service-orientated business. Start looking at the methods that you use to bring in those skills rather than necessarily the specific skills themselves, because the skills will change. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Do you think that answers the question, Tuuli?
I think so, at least partially. But again, if you have any other comments, there is a feedback form at the end.
Yes, there is. Yeah, of course. Yeah. So the second question, this is the one we're going to wrap up on, is if there is no ITSM in the future, what does this mean for the people working in industry now? Which is obviously the tantalising question on everybody's lips throughout this whole research piece that we've done.
Indeed.
And actually, as a part of the research, we held a roundtable discussion with about a dozen rather cool and smart people in the industry, myself and Tuuli included. Maybe I was the odd one out. And that was a really big part of it, is understanding kind of, what does IT service management mean right now, and what does that, how is the meaning of that phrase going to change? Because, like we said, during the poll that we did in the middle of the presentation, like, it's not really going to disappear. It's just going to change. It's just going to converge. It's going to blend in to the rest of the industry. So when we talk about what's going to happen to those people in the industry now, I mean, let's be realistic. When big changes happen, there are some very unforgiving changes that can happen in business, and we've seen that throughout, whether it's IT or whatever. Businesses go through large changes, and they get rid of some stuff, and they bring new stuff in. I suppose what the importance of this question is, how do you make sure that you're not in the stuff that gets gets cast out?
Yeah, and in fact, sometimes that it might be a blessing in disguise if that does happen. So there might be another industry that you find also fascinating, and you can apply some of those customer service skills, those IT skills, those organizational skills that you've built up in service management. And as we said, I think service management and IT itself, I think that's going to be very much absorbed into the business. And yeah, I think there's a lot of answers. I think there's as many answers as there are people working in ITSM at the moment. It's definitely not the topic that I would, if you're working in ITSM, I wouldn't worry about that any more than I would worry about if I worked in any other industry or in any other job, because I think the job market anyway will change so drastically in the next, say, 20 years that I don't think any of the jobs that there are currently, a lot of those will
Every industry
change.
is under threat from automation and AI, just as much as everyone
else.
Really.
But then the people will have much more interesting jobs as well. So the more automation, the more AI there is, the more
someone has to build that, right?
Yeah, someone has to build that. And then what happens when it comes from that robot to a person? That person then deals with much more interesting stuff.
Yeah.
So because we can automate things like access requests, we can automate lots of other things. Then by the time a human interacts in the future, then that will be something a lot more complex where you need that human linking.
And also, something that often comes up in this discussion is what happens to those more sort of back-end infrastructure roles that traditionally exist in an organisation. When we have conversations about those will move out of the business, they won't exist anymore. Of course they'll exist. They exist in different organisations. They exist in cloud-based providers. They exist in SaaS platforms. They exist in the large outsourcing firms that provide those services now. And this is a career decision more than anything, and it's working out whether you want to be a part of this movement or not. But it's understanding that if your business is going to outsource infrastructure to another partner, do you want to move with it? Do you want to then move to that organisation? Because that's a very common thing that happens in SIAM, is that the roles as they're outsourced, the knowledgeable people in the business just get carried over to the suppliers. Yeah.
Because you might, in fact, outsource that entire team, for example, and then just have one person.
You don't want to lose that knowledge, do
you?
No. So I think the what have we got? We got time for one more question?
I'm not sure.
Or should we wrap up?
Well, I think we should wrap up.
Let's wrap up. Yeah. Can you move slides, please? Sorry, 1 second, audience. So I think just to Tuuli, we've talked about a huge amount of stuff today. A couple of sentences, sum it up. What are you taking away? What are you hoping everyone else will take away?
I think we're going to have a very exciting future. I think it's going to be a different future. I think it's going to be much more customer-focused future that we have.
Great. Okay. And if anybody wants to get in touch with Tuuli directly and ask her questions about what she said today, I'm assuming that you're happy for them to contact you. There's details on the screen.
I am.
As I said at the beginning of the presentation, my name is Toby Moore, and I do work with AXELOS and some other organisations too. But if you want to get in touch with AXELOS and ask questions around how you can use some of the guidance that we've talked about today, or if you want to gain access to some of the research that we've talked about, the white paper, the key findings in the white paper should be available in the key resources in this webinar, but we'll also send them out to everybody as well. So if anybody would just like to get in touch, you can either use membership at AXELOS.com on the screen if you'd like to talk about some of the professional development services AXELOS has and talk about those career questions that we talked about. If you've got any more general questions just about how to use the ITIL guidance in order to move forward with some of this stuff, whether you want to start using something like Prince to Agile, that sort of thing, ask at AXELOS.com is where you're going. It's ask at AXELOS.com. So on that note, Tuuli, thank you so much for joining us today. You are always amazing to work with. I love working with you, and I've had a great time as well. This is a really interesting topic for me, and I've really enjoyed being a part of this research piece as well. Thank you to everybody that's joined in on the webinar today. I hope you've had a great time and that you've learned something, and of course this will be available on demand afterwards as well if you want to share it with any of your colleagues or friends, or just watch it again or go and get some little snippets back. Again, Tuuli, thank you very much. Audience, thank you very much. We'll see you next time.